If you want a fuller, bigger kick drum that also will take up more space in your mix and might be hard to control when things get fast, you have more room for that when the song is slower. If you want that, though, you can find the fundamental frequency of the kick drum and boost that, which is usually somewhere between, depending on the tuning of the kick, between 40 and 80 or something.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go.
Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hein. I'm a mixing engineer. My studio is called Outback Recordings. We mix about 200 to 250, sometimes 300 songs per year. So we're working on a lot of songs here, and a lot of these songs are DIY recordings, self-recording bands sending us their stuff to mix. So naturally, we are sometimes working with tracks that are a little bit problematic, and we coach artists through the process of recording better source tracks, improving the arrangements and all of that so that we can do a great job mixing. And this is what led to this platform and this podcast. So now we're giving you these same tips and tricks and this guidance that we give to these artists. So we hope that you can then take this advice and create better recordings in your jam spaces and home studios as well. And we're also sharing mixing tips for those of you who mix themselves. If you're discovering this on YouTube, please know that this is primarily a podcast, so you can listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you enjoy podcasts. And if you're discovering this on a podcast app, please know that there is a video version of this on YouTube. All right. So normally I do this with my co-host and friend, Malcolm Owen Flood, but he is not here today. And I decided for the end of this year to do 2 really quick episodes that are not like high-level, strategic, philosophical, whatever mindset episodes that we sometimes do. These are 2 very short, practical episodes, and please let me know if you like these every once in a while. Then we try to sprinkle them in more often and give you like quick wins, things you can easily implement right away and improve something about your mixes or recordings. So the 2 episodes that I'm going to be doing is this one on how to EQ a kick drum, or how I think about EQing a kick drum. I don't believe in how-tos really. I believe in different approaches that work for different reasons and different, genres and contexts and all of that. But like how I approach EQing kick drums, and maybe you can try that approach too and see if it works for you. And the second one is the same thing, but about snare drums. So let's start with the kick drum episode. The way I think about it is relatively simple. Again, I want to say before we get into this, it's about context. It's about serving the song, about the sound you're going for, the sound in your head, the vision and all of that. So there's no one-size-fits-all kick drum EQ, basically. But there are certain things and approaches and kind of, like I always say, the why behind the decisions that I think can be applied across the board. So a kick drum typically consists to me of a few different parts when we think about the frequency spectrum. The first one is the subs, so the very low end. This is, to me, everything below 60 to 80 hertz, somewhere there. Like everything below that is like the stuff that we can feel more than we can hear it. It is perceived as like really full and sometimes can be boomy, pillowy, big. Some people call it the weight or the size of the kick drum. That kind of big, full, low end. Then there is the upper bass part of it that to me sounds more like a knock or a punch, tighter. It's oftentimes a little shorter and more precise. So that would be, I don't know, like anything 80 to 150 or so, around 100, 80 to 150. So that's kind of the area that I'm thinking of. So that is the 2 parts of the low end, the very subs, and then a little above that, the upper bass region. Then we have the lower mid-range from like, let's say 200 to 600, something like that. And that is to me the cardboardy, or like, let's say 200 to 800 or so. Let's keep it a little more broad. That is kind of the cardboardy, cheap, boxy sounding part of the kick drum to me. And this can be cool for some genres, but oftentimes it sounds, a little boxy, cardboardy. There's sometimes a little bit of room in there. The wood of the kick drum is there. So sometimes you might want more of that. But if you take that away a little bit, if you turn that down a little bit, it often sounds a little more expensive, a little bigger, fuller, deeper, and a little more controlled. Anyway, we get to that. Then we have the mid-range, which would be like the real kind of mid-range, mid-range sort of, which would be 800 to, let's say, 1500 or so. This can be very forward sounding. It can also sometimes be a little plasticky, but this is kind of the mid-range. Completely depends on the context again. Then we get into like beater attack territory. So 1500 to like 5K or so is all like beater attack, click type of thing. And to me, the 1500 to, let's say, 2500 or 3K, this part is like more the rock kick, where it's a little harder sounding, and it sounds more like a hard beater attack, where oftentimes this sounds cool for rock records, not so much the modern metal stuff. It can get a little too much there if you boost that a lot. And then the 4, 5K and above is more like a clicky sound, and the higher you go, the more fine or thin or like papery it sounds, or wet. You can always say like it sounds like it's like someone stepping into a puddle of water, something like that wet kind of sound. This is the higher up you go, the more you get that. And that is cool for metal, for more modern stuff. And then we have the typewriter attack, which like sounds like a typewriter noise, that really top end clicky thing. Can be 8 kilohertz and above for kick drums. Also great for some metal, fine details, So this is kind of how I look at like kick drums. And I'd say depending on your genre, your personal taste and all of that, you can manipulate these areas and play around with that. And here is what I would do and try. So if you want a fuller, bigger kick drum that also will take up more space in your mix and might be hard to control when things get fast, you have more room for that when the song is slower. If you want that, though, you can find the fundamental frequency of the kick drum and boost that, which is usually somewhere between, depending on the tuning of the kick, between 40 and 80 or something, usually, right? And you can find that frequency. You can use an analyzer also to help you find that. The loudest peak down there is oftentimes the fundamental. And you can do it by ear, of course, or both. And find that fundamental and try boosting that. Try bringing that out. You can also go below the fundamental and just boost some weight really down low. You can combine it with a low cut filter, so you can boost subs and still cut the very bottom, like 20, 30 hertz, so that this stuff doesn't get out of control, and kind of shape that down there. If you do that, it gets a little more pillowy, big. In slower songs, there's more space for that. You can make it sound more massive. Sometimes you can boost that stuff in room mics to really have this boomy, kind of big low end. Play around with that if that's what you want. If you boost higher, like 80, 100, 150, somewhere there, to me, this sounds more like a knock. It brings the kick drum forward, makes it a little tighter, makes it a little smaller in a way, but also, just a different type of low end. Play with that and you will hear it. And sometimes that's the move. If you have a really subby bass or synth bass that fills out the subs and there's just not much space for this big kick drum, or if you have fast double kick runs and they just get muddy if the kick drum's too long and uncontrolled down there, you can also reduce the fundamental a bit and shift the focus more to the upper bass and make it tighter a little bit. Both can be cool. Sometimes it can also sound like the drummer is hitting it harder when you boost the upper bass versus the very subs, which can sound a little softer sometimes. Sometimes you can use the subs, though, and use a transient designer to make it shorter and combine the two. Like, there's so many different approaches, but just think about it that way, that typically the subs are the pillowy, big, also a little softer stuff versus, to me at least, the harder, punchier knock kind of thing that is a little above that. And sometimes I want to shift the focus to one or the other. So sometimes I have a growly bass that doesn't have a ton of subs and it plays around 100, 150 and it's really there and the bottom is rolled off because of the cab or whatever, and it's more about the growl, the mid-range, and not so much the subs and the bass guitar. In that case, I often shift the kick drum more towards the fundamental, so I will boost 40, 50, 60, 70, whatever the fundamental is, and then cut around 100 or around 150 or somewhere there to make it more low-end focused, fundamental focused, shift the focus away from the first octave, basically. And this can make the kick drum sound like it's tuned lower. It can make it sound bigger. It can make space for the bass up there. It can let the two work beautifully together. So sometimes the move is to shift it away from this knock down to the fundamental. Totally also depends on how it's tracked. Sometimes people want a big low kick drum, but they didn't know how to tune it properly. And now we have this like kick drum that's a little too high. A sample can be a cool option there. But even if you've just even with EQ, you can do a lot. You can really change the whole focus of the low end of the kick drum by, you know, taking out 10 dBs of 150 and instead boosting 5 dBs at 60 or something, and you get this shift more towards the fundamental. I would be relatively narrow down there. The broader you go with the Q, the bandwidth of the EQ band, the bigger and more pillowy it sounds in the low end. And the narrower you go, the more focused you can be on the fundamental or whatever you want to boost. But usually I'll go pretty narrow down there, especially when I cut. I will find whatever is too much. Sometimes the kick drum has a weird note at around 100, or it's just too much of that knock of that like tight, narrow kind of thing. And if you find that and you narrowly, like with a narrow way, you turn it down 10 dB or so, all of a sudden it sounds bigger, more massive, and then you can boost the fundamental, maybe go a little broader on the boost. But usually go pretty narrow down there and really shape it. Not like notch narrow, but reasonably narrow. Try it out. And use an analyzer because it will show you how broad these areas actually are, and the visual really helps sometimes, at least for the learning process. You should always go with the ears first, but yeah. So then the lower mid-range is kind of, like I said, the boxy, cheap stuff. This is often the first move and sometimes the only move you need to do in a kick drum, where it might sound totally fine. It has enough beater attack. It has enough low end. Everything sounds cool. It's well tracked, or it's a great sample. But maybe it sounds a little cheap and it sounds a little boxy, a little like cardboard. And if so, go to like 400, 500, 300, somewhere there, and move the EQ around and just cut relatively broad actually, and just you don't even have to boost and try to find the annoying frequencies because we're not talking about narrow resonances. Just cut it, use a pretty broad EQ, move it around until you feel like it sounds great and more expensive and bigger and sits better in the mix. And sometimes I find myself cutting 5 or 6 dBs, and sometimes I do 20 because it might sound really, really boxy. And if you do a big cut there and all you're left with is basically the low end, and that is shaped the way you want it, and then the beater attack, that's sometimes all you need. Sometimes you don't need the mid-range at all, and sometimes you need a lot of mid-range. Totally depends on the genre. But play around with that and see if you can clean things up there, because oftentimes you can. Then we have, one nice trick also there is, that is good to keep in mind. The final sound of a kick drum is always the result of the kick drum close mic or mics plus the overheads plus the rooms. It's never the close mic in isolation, unless it's like electronic program music where there's just this one sample. But keep that in mind. Same for the snare, even more so for the snare. We get to that in the next episode. So this means you can clean up the close mic a lot often in the lower mid-range and then let the rooms fill that in, because they'll have a ton of that anyways. So that can be something to keep in mind too. Then we have the mid-range, sort of around 1 kilohertz, 1.5, 800, somewhere there. This, oftentimes I leave that alone. Sometimes I boost a little bit there in a broad way if I want more character, a little more saturation maybe, if I boost it into a compressor or a clipper. Sometimes it can bring the kick drum forward. Sometimes it has a little bit of an attack characteristic, but not the clicky type of attack. Sometimes I need to turn it down, but play around with that. But that's the area that I leave alone most often. But sometimes it can be the move to do a little bit of shaping there. But for the most part, that I leave that stuff alone a lot. And then we have the upper mid-range, which is, again, where it gets very interesting for the attack. So if it's a rock song or a pop song or something not really metal, but still acoustic drums, then I would find a way to broadly boost around 2 kilohertz, 3 kilohertz, somewhere there. Find where the nice present attack of the kick drum beater is, and I try to be very broad and musical there. I don't want narrow, clicky resonances. I just want overall more presence for the kick drum there. And if it's more of a metal song, I might leave that stuff alone, or even cut a little bit if it gets too nasty with fast kick drum runs or whatever, or if the drummer hit really hard and it's clicky anyways, I might even cut a little bit there and go higher for my boost. But for rock, pop, anything that's not super aggressive and modern, or there's not these walls of guitars where we need a super clicky kick drum, I boost that part of the upper mid-range in a broad musical way. Then we go to like 4 or 5 kilohertz territory, where it gets more clicky and the kick drum really cuts through. If you go too narrow there, or if you do too much, it can sound really weird and annoying. If you go a little broader and musical and you find a good spot there to boost, it can be exactly the click you need for the kick drum to cut through the guitars. Sometimes it's a combination of a narrow cut at like a nasty frequency. Sometimes there is this weird point on the kick drum, for the lack of a better term, where it sounds like there's this one narrow frequency, often around 4K, 4.5K, that sounds really nasty and sticks out, and you can narrowly cut that down, but then broadly boost around it. That can oftentimes be the move. So sometimes you can even see that on an analyzer where you have this peak at like 4 kilohertz or something, very narrow. And if you turn it down just a touch, it gets smoother, and then you can boost the overall upper mid-range to compensate. And then higher up, 6K and above, 8K, 10K, especially the 8 and 10K area. If you have an SSL channel strip, the red button, for example, if you just turn that up in the default setting, you just boost it, it's like 8K, something like that. That can sound really modern and cool for like metal, and it gives you the typewriter present kind of attack up there. So yeah, play around with that. So with a heavy music kick drum, the EQ can look like something like this, where you have this big bottom, scooped out low mid-range, relatively neutral upper mid-range, and then boost at the top for the click. With rock, the bottom can look similar or different depending on the arrangement. The upper mid-range might be a little different, where the click is a little lower, and then you don't have that typewriter thing at the top. But usually a kick drum curve in many, many, many cases, and I know people will disagree now and comment like, there's no one size fits all, although I said that in the beginning. But like very often, if you look at EQ curves of most mixers in many, many genres, they look like something like a smiley face, where you have a big bottom, scooped out mid-range, and big top. It's like really simple as that. And if you only have a very simple EQ with 3 bands, like if you imagine like a hi-fi system EQ with bass, mids, highs, what you could do is just boost bass, cut mids, boost highs. That will give you a more finished, processed sounding kick drum in most cases. The details are what I just described in this episode, but in general, it's boosting low end, cutting mid-range, boosting top end. How you do it depends on the genre and how much of that you do. All right, hope this was helpful. Try these things out on your next record and let me know if it worked for you. I hope to see you next week. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with a friend and subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave a review, all that. I don't ask for that a lot, but like I should ask for it more often, because it really helps us grow the show and it helps us reach more people like you. And if you look into our back catalog of episodes, we had amazing guests so far on the show, and we want to do more of that. And it's much easier for us to reach really great guests if we have a lot of reviews and, there's proof that people actually enjoy this podcast, and they're much more likely to come on the show. So if you want that, please leave a review, share it with your friends, help us grow this completely free podcast that hopefully brings you a lot of value. Thank you for listening. See you next week. Bye-bye.